Alright, let's look at a couple examples of how to translate conditional sentences in English into Latin. And this is a really good time to just kind of review the difference between simple conditions and contrafactual conditions, what words we use to indicate the different conditions in English, and to remind ourselves of that chart and to show us how we translate those into Latin, what different tenses we have to use to indicate different kinds of ideas. So, let's look at these four sentences really quickly. Alright, as we look through these sentences, if the king were speaking, the citizens would be listening. If the king should speak, the citizens would listen. If Zeus wanted to be loved by a woman, he had to disguise himself in order to be loved. And if the king were to command the soldiers to attack, they would conquer the enemy. First thing we're going to note, anytime you're trying to figure out how to translate one of these sentences, we see all of them have this if clause. Next thing we do is we go to the main clause and we look for the word would, because would is going to tell us whether or not the condition is going to be contrafactual or simple. So sentence number 1, would, contrafactual. Sentence number 2, would, contrafactual. Sentence number 3, there's no would, this is just a simple condition. Notice simple is sometimes a misnomer. If a sentence is hard, it's just going to use indicative instead of subjunctive. And number 4, would. Alright, so we have 3 contrafactual sentences, one that will be simple in its type of condition. The next thing we're going to look at is we're going to identify tenses. So, the way I tend to identify tenses is I look at these if clauses. If the king were speaking, were indicates present, so sentence number 1, present contrafactual. If the king should speak, should or were to indicates future less vivid, so sentence number 2, future less vivid. Sentence number 3, this is already simple, so now we just have to figure out time. Wanted is past, so this is a simple past condition. And sentence number 4, if the king were to command, were to is the same as should, so number 4 is a future less vivid. Alright, reminding ourselves of that chart, sentence number 1, present contrafactual, uses imperfect subjunctives. Sentence number 2, future less vivid, uses present subjunctives. Sentence number 3, simple past, we're just going to literally translate the different tenses of the indicative. Wanted will just be a future. We'll talk about he had to disguise himself in a moment. We got a nice complicated future passive periphrastic here occurring in the past. And then if the king were to command the soldiers, so once again, this final one, future less vivid, that is a present subjunctive. Well, now that we've spent the time kind of identified all the different all the different types of conditions and identified what tenses we need in Latin, now we can translate them. Now, when I translate these, I always like to start with the main clause, and then I can put the if, the conditional clause, the C clause at the beginning of the sentence. So, the citizens would be listening. Alright, would be listening is just nice third person plural, present in English. So in Latin, we're going to make that imperfect subjunctive, and it's just going to be active. So, if the king were speaking, the citizens would be listening, cives. And then we have to say, okay, imperfect subjunctive, to listen, audio. Imperfect subjunctive looks like that, and we add the endings. The citizens would be listening. Once again, all would be listening is showing us is that this is this continuous action that's occurring right now, not instead of simple aspect. The citizens would be listening if the king were speaking. So CX, and then were speaking. Once again, we just need to figure out deco to speak. Imperfect subjunctive takes a nice form of the infinitive plus the endings. So, si rex dicaret, civis audirent. So we've got if the king were speaking now, the citizens would be listening. Alright, the next sentence is going to be exactly the same, except we're just going to change tenses. So we'll just copy paste that down there for a second. Alright. Instead of dicaret and audirent, though, we've moved to the present subjunctive. Dico, dicare is third conjugation, so if we come here, we beat a liar, so we put an a there and add the endings. Dicat, Audeo, we beat a liar, fourth here, so we want to make sure it goes to audiant, and we're done. If the king were to speak, or it should speak, the citizens would listen. Alright, sentence number 3. If Zeus wanted to be loved by a woman, he had to disguise himself in order to be loved. This sentence is really fun. He had to disguise himself. So first, we have this necessity occurring. When does it happen? He had to in the past. So we have a form of the future passive periphrastic, which we'll use in the past, so we'll use erat. It's showing necessary. It was necessary for him to be disguised. So that's the only way we can translate this section. It was necessary for him to be disguised, and then we have a nice purpose clause at the end, in order to be loved, in order that he be loved. So let's figure this out. He had to disguise himself. It was necessary for him to be disguised. I like this word, so I added it here. To disguise oneself. Similo means to be similar. Dissimilar means to be dissimilar or to be disguised. And since we're in an impersonal gerundive construction, we need to make a neuter in the gerundive. So dissimulandum, first declension, and erat. It was necessary to be disguised. Now, we need it is necessary for who to be disguised? For him, so A. It was necessary for him to be disguised in order that he be loved. Ut clause here. We're going to put the C clause at the beginning, so we don't need to put anything there except he be loved. So once again, to be loved is going to be a passive voice. Third, singular, passive. We know we're in subjunctive. Then we just have to ask sequence of tenses. Well, if we come back to here, we know erat is secondary sequence. Purpose clauses always take same time. Secondary sequence, same time, is going to be an imperfect subjunctive. So, amaretur, in order that he be loved. Alright, so it was necessary for him to be disguised in order that he be loved. That is the final portion of the sentence. Now we have to come to the first half of it. If Zeus, we'll put Jupiter, if Jupiter, Jupiter wanted to be loved by a woman. Alright, wanted, to wish or want is wolo. Wanted in the past, wolo, welly, wolui. So we got to go to perfect, woluit. If he wanted to be loved, amo amare. But amare needs to be passive, so the passive infinitive is amari. If Jupiter wanted to be loved by a woman, nice ablative agent here. Plus we'll use femina for a woman. If Jupiter wanted to be loved by a woman, it was necessary for him to be disguised in order to be loved. Si Jupiter voluit amaria femina dissimulandum ea erat ut amaritor. So notice how all these different pieces of grammar can come together and start forming really complicated sentences. And this is one of the reasons reading Cicero becomes so tricky, is he likes throwing all these different sentences together. Alright, in the final sentence, if the king were to command the soldiers to attack, they would conquer the enemy. Alright, so they would conquer the enemy. We'll start there. We will assume that they is going to be unspoken. It's just part of it's going to be built into our verb. So hostes, conquer the enemy. Alright, remind ourselves here. Where we're at. So if we think through this, hostes, they would conquer the enemy. We're in future less vivid. That takes present subjunctive. Winco, wincere, wincant. They would conquer the enemy. Alright. The enemy would conquer, they would conquer the enemy. This is one of the fun things with Latin. This could mean two totally different things depending on context. And so you have to decide whether or not you think hostes wincant is too confusing, because we take in the enemy would conquer, or we could say they would conquer the enemy. Let's get to the end of a sentence and come back to that, see if we think it makes sense. So let's go to the first half of the sentence now. They would conquer the enemy if the king were to command the soldiers. Alright, see Rex, command. Alright, so We can use impero here. Sure, why not? Impero. But we impero, imperare first conjugation. So we're in subjunctive though in the present. So we beat a liar. Imperet. If the king were to command the soldiers to attack. If the king were to command that, remember we're introducing these lovely indirect commands here, that the soldiers attack. Now we have to think through this. Present here means we're in primary sequence, so we're going to make sure this is also in primary sequence. To attack, we'll use o pugno. So once again, first. So we beat a liar, pugnant. Alright. If the king were to command imperet, that the soldiers attack, the enemy would conquer or they would conquer the enemy. I still see a lot of ambiguity here, so I'm just going to put AE there to help us recognize that they would conquer the enemy. Or you could just repeat milites to make sure that you got rid of any of that confusion. But sometimes authors will just assume you can follow along and they won't even worry about it. So, hopefully that helps us start thinking through this. Notice it is kind of an involved process. It takes some time and there's lots of different things to think through. So good luck if it's kind of slow to start. Take your time and just try and get the larger concepts and see how the sentences work, because in the end what we're really looking for here is pattern recognition and the ability to start processing, oh, it's a condition, oh, I see that it's subjunctive, I know it's contrafactual, would. The rest of it will come as we practice. So good luck!